Hey, I want to talk about Family Guy, and I want to just analyze it a bit, give my thoughts on it, and the pros and cons. I've been watching Family Guy now for quite a long time. Certainly not throughout the duration of the run, which goes way back to 1999. It's probably now one of the longest running animated adult orientated cartoons out there. Um, Created by Seth MacFarlane. Who's a pretty famous character. He controversially hosted the Oscars a few years ago. Um, Before getting into Family Guy and its backdrop and my thoughts on it, I guess it's appropriate to talk a little bit about my sense of humor because I do think humor is very subjective. Um, it does irritate me a bit when people say things like just have a sense of humor because everyone has a different sense of humor, so you can't impose that on anyone. Just like you can't be overly puritanical and want to ban things regarding humor, I also think you can sort of insist that other people find something funny if they don't. So, on this side of the pond, I like Steptoe and Son, which is now quite dated, but it was still a funny premise. And basically, for American viewers, think Sanford and Son, Steptoe and Son was the original. I thought the play off father and son, the love hate relationship worked really well. I did like Faulty Towers. I liked Father Ted, which was an Irish production but very popular in the UK. And in both cases of Faulty Towers and Father Ted, neither ran for particularly long, but both were pretty popular and successful. In the UK, there is a strong popularity with stand-up comedians. I have to be honest, I've never got into that. People like Peter Kay and others. It's not that I'm necessarily hostile to them individually, but I'm put off by the likes of Frankie Boyle and Roy Chubby Brown, who I think are just basically shock jocks. Um, I think a lot of the stand-up routine nowadays is who can shock the most, and that some of it's witty, but I think it's based too much on the shock factor. And there's definitely been a change in the days of someone like Tommy Cooper, which would be, many would consider very tame today, but there's definitely been a change there where it's shock for shock value. Um, then on the other side of the pond, it goes without saying I'm a huge Friends fan. I like the humor in Friends because I think it was witty without being pretentious. What I mean by that is it wasn't trying to be so witty, too witty for its own good. It was it wasn't overly comprehensive, it wasn't overly smart, but I think people resonated with that. They related to the characters, they liked it, and that's why it was so successful. I know there's a school of thought out there that Seinfeld's a lot better, it's cleverer. I think Friends had the much bigger influence. I can't say much about Seinfeld because I haven't watched enough of it, but for me, it was always Friends. Um, Contemporary American comedy. I do like a lot of Will Ferrell stuff. I like the Anchorman series, and I liked the Campaign. Thought that was a very funny film. Step Brothers, few Ben Stiller flicks. I haven't seen enough of Adam Sandler to really comment. And as for contemporary British comedy on air, I like some dark comedy, Psychoville, which was around about 10 years ago. Um, the League of Gentlemen. Little Britain has some funny sketches, although it's a bit silly. So yeah, that's basically my humor, I guess. It's hard to pigeonhole into one box, but if there's any sort of outtake from all of that, that is my humor. Um, so Family Guy. I should say I've watched The Simpsons for many years as well, and The Simpsons and Family Guy are often compared either favorably or unfavorably. I think The Simpsons is definitely tamer than Family Guy. Um, Both have political angles, although Family Guy more so. Okay, if you're not familiar with Family Guy, basically it revolves around a character, Peter Griffin, who's an overweight, very dense, quite crude Irish American man from Quahog, Rhode Island, which is based very loosely on Providence, Rhode Island, although the skyline is pretty much identical. and his immediate family is Lewis, who's kind of a Jewish American princess type character, or at least she comes from a somewhat privileged background, very privileged background, I should say. Their children, Chris Griffin, who's somewhat like his father, very dense, typical teenage boy, but very well. That the character introduces himself if you check it out. Meg Griffin, who's kind of an awkward girl, who's a long running butt of jokes. There's a long running theme in the comedy that of bullying Meg, and I'll come back to that. The standout characters, in a sense, are Stewie. Although, yeah, Stewie and the dog Brian. Brian is an anthropomorphic dog. I think I'm saying that correctly. Um, and the long running joke with Brian is he's very liberal in his politics. He's quite stuck up. He's quite pretentious, and he kind of sees himself as an academic, but he's constantly in situations where he's exposed as a bit of a hypocrite. Now, the baby is kind of an evil genius. Not always evil, but he's definitely got a malicious streak. He's also very camp, and there's strong gay undertones there. Um, Now, really, it's Brian and the baby who are the standout characters. The baby is called Stewie, but it was actually Cleveland, who's Peter's black friend, who got his own show. So I'm not quite sure why they went down that line. You would have thought it would be Brian and Stewie, but anyway, that's what happened. So Peter's friends, like I say, Cleveland, who's a very amicable kind of, he's a black guy, but in a sense, he's not a typical black guy. He's not like a brother from the hood. Yeah, it doesn't quite fit into that mold. There's Joe, who's a paraplegic policeman, and he's got this kind of complex whereby he feels he needs to make up for the loss of his legs. So he's very well built in his upper body. He's a man's man. He's got a very hot wife, Bonnie. Then there is Glenn Quagmire, who's an airline pilot and who is basically an extremely promiscuous womanizer who's obsessed by sex. And his catchphrase is diggity. So he says that anything he says has a sexual overtone to it. And they're pretty much the main characters. There's a lot of supporting characters. The mayor of Quahog is an erratic, crazy